Hello, today I am trying out a new mechanical keyboard with a twist. I have here my first product from Thirdreality, their Smart Mechanical Keyboard MK1, which they've kindly reached out and sent to me for review. So what makes it smart? Well, it connects directly to your smart home via Matter. This means you can trigger automations in your smart home by pressing keys on your keyboard, regardless of what computer it's plugged into, and even when the computer is locked. I am really looking forward to using this, as it means I can repurpose this Zigbee button, which I have here for another project. Subscribe to see what I do with it. But before we get too deep into all the clever features of this keyboard, let's unbox it and see what you get inside. Out of the way, old Apple keyboard, and hello to Thirdreality. Once we get inside, we've got some very simple packaging, just in a cardboard box. And the very first thing you find is the manual, which doesn't really have to tell you much. It's pretty simple to set up. You plug it into your computer like any other, and you scan the code on the back like any other Matter device. So the very first thing I noticed after getting it out of all of this packaging is that it just feels really nice. The keys are very tactile. The whole thing feels very premium, and it just looks as good as any other mechanical keyboard on the market. If you gave this to me to type on blind, I wouldn't know the difference between this and, say, a Razer keyboard. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get it plugged in and added into my smart home. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to fire up Apple Home on my phone, making sure that I'm on the correct Wi-Fi, and scan the code on the back of the keyboard. And just wait for it to be added into my Apple Home. Once it's added, I'm going to select the room that it needs to go into. In this case, it's in my study. And then I simply give it an appropriate name, and that's it added into Apple Home. Tap done, scroll down, and I can find it here in my study straight away. Now I'm going to head straight into the properties and scroll down and enable pairing mode so that I can add it to Home Assistant as well. This process also went as smoothly as it ever does. Simply click Add New Matter Device, say it's already in use in Apple Home, and paste in the code. And this step happens a lot quicker than in Apple Home. I did get a bit of a weird error about thread here. My theory is that there's some code in there that's trying to do a thread communication, even though this keyboard doesn't use it. But I simply click continue, and everything does seem to work just fine. Now, as you can see out of the box, you hold the Matter key and press a function key to trigger its Matter button, but I will show you shortly other ways of configuring the keyboard. Okay, now it's time to find out what this keyboard can really do. Since this keyboard is backlit, I assumed it would ask me to download some bloated software to configure its lighting effects, but I was actually pleasantly surprised when I visited the URL in the manual. Instead of being greeted with a download screen that only offered me drivers for Windows, I immediately saw an option to grant access to my keyboard. This was in Chrome, by the way. And once I did, I was genuinely blown away. I immediately saw a 3D render of my keyboard with tons of options for manually configuring each and every key with different key actions, macros, and loads more options. Let me show you. This is it, that brilliant browser-based keyboard configuration software. Just look at that lush visualization at the top. It's obviously black, but there's a crazy number of options in this software, and I think you can even change that visualization to look more like the real thing. So I'm going to head straight over to the lighting section first. There's an indicator thing, which is something to do with when you press the caps lock key, which wasn't too interesting. So I'm going to head straight over to the main backlight section. In here we have a whole list of effects which look like they could have come straight out of WLED. You can change all the keys to be one solid color, obviously like this, and there's a few effects which don't seem to do that much. Maybe they're just not working quite right yet, but there's a whole bunch of static effects with gradients, breathing lighting effects, and all sorts of other stuff. In actual fact, I just realized that I spent nearly 30 minutes on these clips going through every single lighting effect, so I'm just going to speed this section up and let you get a rough idea for all of the crazy effects that this thing can do. but I'm going to leave it on something like raindrops, which I think makes good use of the different colors, but also shows me in a decent brightness every key at once, which I found that a basic scrolling rainbow pattern didn't do very well. I kind of had to wait for the pattern to light up the key that I wanted to look at, which of course I'm only fussed about whilst I'm learning the keyboard and actually looking down at it anyway. As I mentioned before, there's a crazy number of options for this keyboard, so I'm not going to go through everything in this video, but as you can see here, it makes it super easy to rebind keys to do what you want. So here, the most common function keys that I used on my old Apple keyboard were to control the volume. So I'm literally clicking on the desired key on the visualization above and going into the media section in this example and selecting the media key that I want to trigger when I press that key. And then once that's all done, you can then save a JSON file to your computer, which basically backs up this whole config, and then you can make a bunch more changes and save another version and switch between the versions freely as you like by re-uploading them into this configurator view. There is also a macros section, which I haven't really explored, but I imagine that gamers would love that option too, to be able to bind different key presses to different macros where you're permitted to in your relevant games, of course. There is even a diagnostic section which allows you to press the keys and see feedback on the screen that key is being pressed okay, and even hear an audible feedback for each key press so that you can be sure that it is working okay. This is actually great. It's not a feature that I've ever seen on a keyboard before. I'm sure others have done it, and I would have found it super useful after a few particularly rage-quitty gaming sessions where I wasn't sure if a certain key was still working. Okay, now that I'm done getting the physical keyboard set up just the way I want it, it's time for its real party trick. Let's set up some automations on its function keys. I started off by trying to create a new automation using an entity state action as the trigger, but that didn't seem to give me what I wanted. So I did as I often do, and I went to create an automation from the device's screen itself, as that sometimes gives you the option that you want to trigger an automation more easily. But when that didn't work either, I was a little bit stumped, and I was worried that this wasn't going to work in Home Assistant. But luckily, I eventually worked out that you can trigger an automation from an entity state like I originally tried to do. I simply had to select the button that I want and then leave the to and from fields blank. Since it doesn't currently support single or double or long presses, it doesn't list any useful button state at all. So just watch out for that if you're a Home Assistant user. For what it's worth, it was easy as usual to create an automation within Apple Home, but the button numbering sadly did not correspond to the correct function key. So you need to trigger a button on the keyboard and see which one highlights in the Apple Home app in order to go through working out which button is which. Once I'd saved the automation in Home Assistant and confirmed that this method did indeed work, I set about adding a few other actions to this automation based on which button was pressed. On F1, I made it toggle my main lighting in here. F2 toggled my fan, which is really useful as it's currently boiling hot where I live. And F3 made it toggle my blind, which is useful for managing the light and heat coming in. With that done, I moved on to the next section of function keys and added my most commonly used scenes in here to F5 to 7. And then promptly ran out of ideas for what else I could use the other F keys for. Let me know down in the comments if you've got any good ideas for what else I could trigger with all of these buttons. By the way, I also want to mention here for the keyboard nerds watching that this is a proper mechanical keyboard with yellow switches which feel great to type on. I was historically more of a blue switch user, but the yellow keys feel and sound pretty nice. So you can, of course, remove all of the keycaps pretty easily, especially if you have the proper tool, which I do, but of course could not find for this clip. But even with a basic penknife, as you can see, they pop off and stick back on pretty easily. And all in all, this is a really fantastic keyboard. Even if you were to remove its smart functionality, I would probably use it day to day, as long as I could get used to that teeny tiny enter key. But with the Matter connectivity and all of those function buttons, it's absolutely going to be my new daily driver. At least until they release a full version with like a number pad and a full-sized enter key. The only minor annoyance that I've really experienced with this keyboard so far that isn't a preference like the size of the enter key was that I couldn't trigger automations super quickly one after the other. I think there's some sort of debounce on how quickly you trigger different automations, possibly to stop you from pressing 2 at once by accident. But I found that I had to sort of wait a second between presses, and then it was typically pretty reliable. Really quick addition to this part of the video. As I was editing it, I figured out what this was. It's not a debounce on the keyboard. It was Home Assistant's fault. Sometimes when I was running a script or automation from the button press, that automation took a few seconds to run because of the actions that it was performing, even including a wait in some cases. And that had to finish running before it would allow the next one to run, because I bundled them all into one automation. So all I had to do to fix this was to go into the automation, tap the 3 dots in the top right, select change mode, and select restart, so that one automation could interrupt the previous one, and then it ran immediately. But if you would like to pick one of these up, the link will be on my website, as always. And remember, if you see this video on my homepage, it will be linked directly below the video to make it easy for you to find. And as always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting the channel in any way that you can, even if it's just by hitting subscribe. And remember, home is where the smart is.